Money FM 89.3, best of breakfast. Eco Money on Money FM 89.3.
Welcome to Eco Money. Since the launch of WWF's Sustainable Banking Assessment back in 2017, Asian banks have made notable strides when it comes to embedding environmental, social, and governance principles, or ESG for short, into their operations. According to their latest report, banks across Asia are now recognizing ESG risks and incorporating them into comprehensive risk management frameworks. However, there are still key gaps in areas such as the lack of inclusion of marine and water-related risks into client requirements, with only 9% of banks requiring clients in high-risk sectors or geographies to perform water risk assessments, and only 5% of banks require clients in the marine-related sector to obtain relevant certifications. There's also still a lack of requirements for clients to develop climate-related mitigation plans and align their activities with the Paris Agreement. For more insights on this, we're joined by Prashanth Warrier, Vice President for Asia Sustainable Finance at WWF-Singapore. Prashanth, welcome to The Breakfast Show. Thanks so much for joining us.
Hello. Hi. Good morning. A pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good morning. It's great to have you on. So we know that ASEAN banks have made great strides over the last 8 years of assessments. How do they compare with international banks, and which areas of improvements should take priority, you think, in the coming year?
It's been a very interesting journey. And just to give the listeners some context as well, the way in which we go about our assessments is through the SUSBA tool, which is a scorecard where we measure how different banks are doing on these ESG metrics, right? So we have done this over the past 8 years, and for the past 5 years, we have largely used the same framework. So we decided to do a look back from 2019 to 2024. How has the progress been? And it's been quite encouraging because a lot of the ASEAN banks have caught up over the last 8 years over this journey. And we see that they're very close right now when it comes to international best practices. So when you look at it at a larger context, the international best practice banks that we assess, there are about 10 of those banks, and then there are the 50 banks in Asia, right? So the 10 international best banks would score probably, on an average of about 85% out of our total possible 100%, right, on our scorecard. And we see that in the different ASEAN countries that we analyze, in each of these countries, there are at least one or two banks, one or two financial institutions that are very close when it comes to these international best practices. So that shows that in each of these countries, there are banks that are quite forward-thinking in terms of their ESG strategies. And that creates a conducive environment for the other banks as well to have stronger policies towards working towards these goals, right? In terms of the country averages, we see that by comparing the international banks, where we assess banks in UK, France, and so on, here in Asia, Singapore, Japan, Korea, Malaysia have been doing well as an ecosystem. And we have seen encouraging growth in other regions as well, like Indonesia, Philippines, and so on. So in terms of the way forward, I think we have analyzed this through the SUSBA maturity model, which goes through 4 different phases. On the first 2 phases, which is acknowledging risks related to sustainable finance and ESG principles, and phase 2, which is implementing policies, most of the banks have made considerable progress. The way forward we see is in phase 3 and phase 4, which deals with banks setting clear action plans and escalation mechanisms for clients who are under higher risk, and actually in phase 4 setting net zero commitments and targets and increasing their financing when it comes to nature and climate related products. So that's an area which we're quite keen to work on, especially when it comes to increasing the financing. I think that is the important challenge that we need to address going forward through the private sector.
Yeah, so some encouraging updates that we got there. So now looking at international dynamics, with Trump returning back to office in the U.S., we did see the U.S. withdraw from the Paris Agreement. And billionaire entrepreneur Michael Bloomberg is also stepping forward and announced that his foundation will step in to fund the UN climate change body. So in such scenarios, right, does the absence of a key player like the U.S. kind of disrupt the flow of financial resources to climate-related initiatives?
Yes, I think so. The U.S. has made this decision. They've cited prioritization of their local industries and economy. But the important aspect is that the work towards building this climate-resilient future has to continue, because through the SASBA assessment as well, we see that there are clear linkages between regulations and market forces, for example, through the maturity model. Now, the Bloomberg Foundation stepping in to fund or to close this gap can be seen in a way as an example of how the private sector and philanthropy are coming in to fill some of these gaps left by the government withdrawal, right? And from a larger perspective, what we are clearly seeing is that there is a global financing gap for climate for about $9.2 trillion. Now, while government agreements are important, the most important aspect going forward is going to be how can private financing be scaled. And at a larger level, I think the global shift towards renewable energy and sustainable practices is not just driven by policy, but also by economic incentives, technology advancements. So we are hopeful that the trend towards increasing sustainable financing will continue with the help of market forces, although potentially at a slower pace than we'd ideally like. So we'll have to wait and see how financial institutions work on this. But at WWF, we believe that, ESG is not just important for the environment, but also for businesses in terms of competitiveness, portfolio risk, maintaining a future-looking outlook. And purely from a financial sense, we saw how the recent wildfires in LA, we saw how that has financial consequences as well, right? So you're talking about property losses of over $250 billion US, insured losses alone reaching $40 billion. So there are financial metrics to be considered as well when you look at these, key aspects which can affect climate and the impact it has on finance. So there is long-term stability that needs to be kept in mind while taking these larger decisions. So we are hopeful that we can arrive at a consensus going forward, but at the moment, our work still continues, and we are excited to see how we can support financial institutions in this journey.
Yeah, so let's talk about the funding gap that you just described. On the topic of nature financing, Target 19 of the Global Biodiversity Framework calls for $900 billion annually to address the biodiversity funding gap. But nature-negative finance flows, like those supporting fossil fuels and agriculture, are estimated at $7 trillion annually. So what challenges do banks face then in addressing these imbalances?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, this $7 trillion nature negative financing is something that WWF had published in the Banking for Nature Positive report last year. And that's quite a striking number, right? Because at a macro level, it shows the amount of financing that's going towards industries that are having an negative impact on the environment through fossil fuels, agriculture, construction, and so on. I think the key challenge, or the way in which we look at it when we are supporting financial institutions, is now each financial institution, each bank needs to assess what is their specific impact when it comes to nature negative financing, right? So that's where a bank now uses these frameworks which have come into the picture. So you rightly mentioned the Global Biodiversity Framework, and then we also have the TNFD, which is the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, which is now providing a blueprint as to how banks can go about assessing the different industries that they're financing and understand where is the impact that these industries are having on nature and biodiversity-related metrics. Now, when you look at the challenges, I think one intuitive thing that you might think about is that, okay, when I'm looking at climate impact, you have carbon dioxide and CO2 equivalent, and that's one quantifiable metric that I can use to measure my impact, right? Whereas when you're talking about nature and biodiversity, it's a bit more difficult because you have multiple quantifiable metrics here. You're talking about water, you're talking about deforestation loss, you're talking about, biodiversity and wildlife species extinction, right? So there are so many different factors, and some of these can be a bit more difficult to actually quantify. So that understanding how that data analysis and reporting needs to be done and filling those data gaps are one of the key challenges. And rapidly, this is being addressed and supported because from what we have seen when it comes to climate reporting over the last 10 years, several of those learnings have been put into place when it comes to filling these data gaps a lot quicker this time around. So we are hopeful that the nature metrics will have, the required data for assessment at a much faster pace. And then there's the other aspect of actually shifting the market demand, right, from what are traditional financial investments towards more innovative or financing instruments that are aimed at more of environmental impact, for example. And then on top of all of this, I think there is the regulatory push as well, which is slowly picking up for nature financing. And we are hopeful that with that regulatory push, what it does is it raises the minimum benchmark. Right. So while there are financial institutions that go ahead of the regulations and have more innovative products, I think if you want to shift the overall ecosystem, you need the regulatory push. So we are hopeful that will come in. But the idea is you don't wait for that. You continue the work towards working towards this large financing gap that we're trying to close.
Yeah. So Prashanth, you brought up, innovative financing mechanisms. Have you seen any that can help scale up these nature positive investments globally?
Yes, so I think we talk about a few of these examples when we go into our latest SASBA report, and one of them is the Amazon reforestation bond, right, which is a $225 million bond that was issued in August of 2024. The reason why these bonds are a sign of encouragement is because you're tying financial returns with an impact component as well, right? So you get a fixed return by investing in these bonds, but a portion of that money also goes into, in this case, it goes into reforestation project in Brazil's Amazon rainforest, right? And then you're measuring the outcome through carbon removal units in this case. And that provides a direct incentive for successful project implementation, and it also aligns financial performance with your environmental goals, right? So this is just one example. In terms of nature financing, it is still a nascent market, but we are encouragingly seeing more of these products coming out there. And it encourages innovation as well in terms of tying financial rewards to impact. And we need a lot more of these products going forward in various themes. So this is one example of reforestation, but we are hopeful that we can apply this towards other themes as well and have a suite of products for investors to choose from.
All right, so some encouraging improvements, but still some major gaps to address, especially in scaling up nature-positive investments and aligning activities with global climate goals. Prashanth, thanks for being on the show. Really appreciate your time and your insights.
Thank you.
We've been speaking with Prashanth Warrier, Vice President for Asia Sustainable Finance at WWF-Singapore. Stay ahead with Money FM 89.3.
To listen to more great interviews, download our podcasts at audio.sg or download the audio app. That's AWEDIO, audio at the App Store and Google Play.